The Marvel Snap devs have made several patches in a row that made me go, whoa, and this is no exception. Hot on the heels of the nerf to Loki and Elsa Bloodstone, a nerf to the next most played recent card, Mobius M Mobius, and now he is an on reveal card that only works on the next turn. And I am just a little bit perturbed at the pattern that this represents to me for two reasons. So the first one, of course, is I do think that this means that Loki is set to be probably the best deck again, which is problematic a little bit. And the second is if you were being smart with your purchases over the last few months, what you would have done is purchased probably Loki and Elsa and Mobius, and now they've all been nerfed. And I think that is not a good precedent to set because it makes it very hard for anyone trying to be smart with their purchases to be confident that what they're purchasing is going to hold its value. Now, I do think that I can understand if we take a look at the metagame where it was 3, maybe 4 weeks ago when this patch was likely locked in. I can understand how thinking Mobius is problematic is a reasonable thought. I mean, I had the same thought, but my thought was, let's make it 2-1. Let's not nuke him, I wanted to make him 2-1. Jeff wanted to make him 2-2. We didn't think it was needed a nuke because he was doing a good job of managing Loki. And I don't think this version does a good job of that. He's not managing Loki anymore. And that means that I'm very worried that we're going right back into just the worst Loki meta that we had when it was just all mirrors and then the weirdest combo decks of all time to try and beat up on Loki. I do think there are a lot more people aware of stuff like Phoenix Force as a real deck now, so maybe that helps, but I really don't want to go back into the Loki and Cerebro 3 and Hela and Phoenix meta because that was not a fun place to be. And I worry that nerfing Mobius does more to help Loki than the nerf to Loki did to hurt Loki. And so for that reason, this is a very worrying nerf for me. I would say I understand why it was probably done 3 weeks ago, but I would not make this change right now, just if I were in charge of it. Now, this is the change I would probably make. I have a lot more sympathy for them looking at a card that is underperforming and saying, all right, we got to do something about this. What I don't exactly understand is why this couldn't happen in an OTA. It is an entirely power and cost-based change, which is weird, right? I don't know why it couldn't happen in an OTA, but I am happy for Ravonna Renslayer to actually be a legitimate card. Now, I think the ability to curve, Ravonna Renslayer into the stuff you really want to do is very important here. Now, Cerebro 3, which mostly wasn't playing her anyway, does lose her as an option, but I do think this is an overall significant buff to the card. And the real buff that this card is getting is that we are no longer going to be seeing Mobius everywhere in the meta, which just sort of deaded her immediately. Now she is actually going to get a chance to shine as a real card. I think I'm going to have to go buy her. I'm actually fairly excited to play around with her. That's not a recommendation that you do that, of course, because I am a super whale who plays the game for a living, so definitely not a recommendation that you go do that, but do keep an eye on her. It's not like she's the worst card to pin right now at 3,000 tokens, but I do think this also highlights another sort of issue with the way Marvel Snap releases cards. And this sort of goes back to what we talked about with Mobius, which is if you were smart, you missed this card and then they buffed it. And now you're like, oh, well, now I can't really get the card unless I spend tokens on it, which is worse than spending cashes on it. And it sort of highlights the issues with how they went about doing this season, which is to say, in theory, it makes a lot of sense to say this card is too strong and we're going to nerf it and you should know that we can nerf it. And this card is too weak and we're going to buff it and you should know that we can buff it. But the fact is that it's very difficult to figure out what you should be spending your resources on as a player. And the fact that these cards are changing so fast makes that a lot harder to do. What's the safest card you can buy right now? Probably Jeff and then Thanos, and it's fine, but it's a little bit iffy when all these new cards come out with sort of the explicit goal of let's see what the meta looks like with this, right? Let's see what the meta looks like with a month of Mobius, right? And if that's not being communicated to the players, right? if the players aren't knowing, hey, this is like an experiment, it might change in the future, I think that doesn't jive very well with how they've made their card acquisition system work. So for me, in the future, if they want to experiment and see how the metagame looks, I think the only real way to do that is by buffing early cards that are more easily accessible rather than doing it with cards they are releasing now. And I think that is a consequence of just how punishing it is to guess wrong on whether a card is worth buying or not, because there's a pretty high price tag on that. The opportunity cost on an incorrect guess is very high, and decision paralysis is a real thing. Boy, if you thought we were done with the wild stuff, we are not done with the wild stuff. Wave is now no longer a cost prohibitor. All she is going to do now is bring costs down if they are above 4. She is a pure Galactus / ramp card now. What I am interested in figuring out is, does this new iteration of Wave work with Death again? I am tempted to think the answer is still no. My understanding of this card is that it is going to be exactly the same as the current Wave, except it doesn't stop anyone from playing anything anymore. It just makes it so you can play your cheap cards, which is, not actually terrible when you think about it, right? Like, how people were doing like Mobius plus Wave and then doing like Doctor Doom plus a 2-drop? It does let you do that, and there is 2 more power on it. Like, I think most people are going to look at this and be like, well, she's dead. And I don't actually know that that's true. Like, 3/5 with an ability that lets you ramp out a 6-drop on 4 is pretty interesting, honestly. Like, especially when you think about, like, okay, what Galactus was doing with the card, right? Galactus was a deck that really wanted to have priority. 3/5 really helps that as opposed to a 3/3. And it just wants to cheat a Galactus out anyway. So I kind of wonder if this isn't, like, it's not obviously it's not a buff, right? But Wave decks that were using her as a cost restrictor were already kind of not a thing because of the existence of Mobius. And so the only decks that she was really seeing playing were decks that actually, like, are kind of okay with this kind of trade-off. I'm interested to see how it goes, honestly, because, obviously when they got rid of Mobius, they were like, okay, well, we can't have Wave running around now. Like, we can't go straight back into Wave meta. We have to, like, have some other things that people can do. Now, as far as how this affects the metagame, I mean, Bounce comes to mind as a deck that, Wave didn't necessarily beat Bounce, but it was a big reason why Bounce didn't get a larger meta share. As far as what Wave decks look like, my first thought would be Galactus. If you are an aficionado of stopping those pesky Bounce players, there is a slight buff in hand for you. Sandman getting a little bit of extra power with the explicit goal of making it so, okay, look, if Bounce gets out of control, we can stop him. If Loki gets out of control, we can stop him. Although I will say Loki, a lot harder to deal with the Sandman than Bounce, because when you play Sandman into Loki and they have like Collector and Loki, what they do is just play your cards and have more stats than you. So Sandman, I think, is likely to have a pretty poor Loki matchup, but it should keep some of the more really obnoxious things from entering the metagame. I don't think it does well into Loki, but, it could really beat the hell out of some Bounce decks, especially on ladder. That's always been Sandman's forte. And I do want to take a little minute to talk about what happens when Sandman is good, because traditionally the way it goes is Sandman is good, and then people realize there is a deck that can put out a lot of power, more power than Sandman, while also playing 1 card a turn. In past metas, that has been, like Patriot with Ultron, right? That was like kind of the thing that that deck would do. It's also been Shuri occasionally. So if you start seeing a bunch of Sandman, which I don't particularly think you will, but I won't rule it out, people like the card, there are some pretty well-defined counters that you can explore. Just look for decks that can beat Sandman on its own terms, because then you just sort of kind of ruin what they're trying to do. The whole premise of the deck is, I'm going to use my energy a little bit inefficiently on this 5/4 because I believe that it hurts you more than me. And if you can make that even slightly not true, you have a big advantage in the matchup. I tend to draw an analogy between that and, like, flipping the Red Skull lane against a Shuri deck. It's kind of the same thing. You take what they're good at and you sort of flip it on their head, and then suddenly the deck is not prepared to deal with anything that you're doing. I think a lot of people are going to overlook this change to Negasonic Teenage Warhead. But I really do think this makes her an extremely interesting card. Because now, I mean, she's not Alioth per se. As I understand it, The card will still reveal, it'll still get its on reveal effects. But it is kind of budget Alioth. Like, that's a really interesting card. Like, at that cost, it's a tool that a lot of decks can use that is not Alioth. It's a very interesting sort of priority type win condition. This is going to be a legitimately good card, I think. I don't know if it'll find the space to define itself outside of Alioth, but at 3 cost, it's a very unique tool. Nothing else really does what it does. And being able to destroy stuff, especially like, say, through a Cosmo, is a really interesting place for this card to be in, because that is a genuinely unique ability. Nothing else can actually do it. And that's powerful, honestly. Now, the fact that it only works once per game, I mean, how else would it work? I guess like it would be a little bit ridiculous, but like, I think this card got a very significant buff, because previous buffs to Negasonic, they like buffed her power, and it's like, well, she's still blowing herself up. So here they took off the power and they made her only blow up the opponent's cards. And suddenly I think this is like a legitimate card. Like, this is something that is very scary to see. I am very worried about what it could do in like a Silver Surfer type shell. I'm even more worried about, of course, playing it and then the opposing Loki gets it and I just die. Like, there's a lot of very powerful things that this card can do. I do not think that it should be underestimated. Finally, just a minor change to Ant-Man, which basically just means he works in the Space Throne now. You're probably not going to be using that very much. It's unlikely you're going to want to put 4 power in the Space Throne, but go nuts. Feel free to put 4 power in the Space Throne. If that is what your game plan calls for, Ant-Man can now do it. As far as everything else, this does not seem to be anything other than a change to how he works on Space Throne. And Alioth getting a little bit of an errata. Now it'll only destroy cards that are on the enemy side. So goblins are now something of a counterplay to Alioth. As long as you have priority, you can actually like play the goblin and then, oh, it won't actually blow up the Alioth, but like, you know, their lane's probably going to be full anyway. It's not really a big deal, but hey, a little nerf to Alioth, not like a super relevant one, but if Ravonna Renslayer ends up being more meta, we might see more goblins. I don't know. It's possible. One interesting situation where this does open up some counterplay is there's a lot of Galactus Alioth decks that's like, all right, well, I don't have Galactus, so I'm going to wave out this Alioth, and hopefully I'll guess where they put their thing. That happens a lot, so, you know, if you goblin them there, you know that your play is safe as long as you have priority. That's actually like a pretty interesting thing, because the goblin is also, of course, good against Galactus. So there's something to be said for this actually mattering more than never. I just don't think it's a particularly common situation, but I did want to highlight that, like, there are some situations where this could actually be impactful. Now, in the patch notes under the section on Mobius, the devs noted that they wanted feedback on their strategy of using a new card to temporarily alter the play patterns of the game. They also note that they eventually did expect to have to do something about Mobius, which to me means they went into this saying, all right, I want to see what Mobius does to this. It's going to be a little too strong, but I want to see how it goes. And they asked for feedback on how that works. And I have a little bit of feedback, and I think this is probably the important part of the video. I touched on this in the Mobius and Ravonna sections, but I think that there is a very big problem with using new cards to temporarily change the metagame unless this is clearly communicated as temporary. One of the major questions that I get as a content creator is, yo, KM, what do I buy? And the subtext of that question is, how am I best meant to spend the resources that I have to optimize my ability to climb ranks? That's what people ask me that question for. With other people, they maybe ask it for a different reason. But if you're asking me that question, you're asking, what are the best purchases for me to convert my tokens and my caches into ranks? And I can only give the accurate answer, right? For the last 2 months, it was get Elsa, get Loki, get Jeff, get Mobius, right? That's correct, right? I didn't know that they were doing a temporary thing, right? Like, I had no idea. And that's really frustrating because, like, there are people, I know this from my podcast comments, who are like, yo, you could finally convince me to get Elsa. It's like, and then they nerf her. And I think that it is actually extremely, extremely bad to use new cards as a temporary way of generating meta shifts, because what Second Dinner needs to avoid is the perception of churn. And I've been picking up on this a lot lately, where there's like this overarching sort of miasma where the general implication, this comes from like a bunch of different places, but I get comments that are like, oh, you content creators just crying for nerfs. And I'm like, why would anyone be mad about that? And I started thinking about it, and what they're mad about is, I think, they think it's like a sort of cycle where a broken card gets released, all the content creators are like, whoa, this is broken, and then we're like, whoa, this is broken, you have to nerf it, and then they nerf it, right? And I don't really think it goes that direction, but I think it's bad if that's what they're doing. Like, I don't think we as content creators are responsible for, you know, any of the nerfs that they have made exactly. Like, we probably are just picking up on stuff that is already there. And I think especially when the devs just come out and say like, yeah, we kind of figured we might have to do something about this, it makes me feel like that should not be a thing because people are spending their tokens on this. People are spending their credits on this. People are spending the resources that they have, and they're trying to allocate it cleverly, and they don't know that you're running an experiment. So I think that especially doing it with new cards is a huge issue because it creates that perception of churn. Hey, here's a broken card, go buy it, then we're going to nerf it later. And then we're going to release another broken card, and then go buy it, and then we're going to nerf it later. And I think that needs to be avoided at all costs. I think that is a terrible cycle for a game to fall into. And I do think that I have a bit of constructive advice for the devs if they watch this. I would say that if you want to experiment with new cards, if you want to experiment with new metas, you need to do it with cards people own already. And that's not your fault. I assume at least that the gameplay team is not the same people that designed the current card acquisition system. But the way Marvel Snap works is cards are free, very hard to get, very hard to get, very hard to get. That's how the game works. And when you put extra stress on the very hard to get bit, that is a bad thing. I think if you had just changed literally any card in pool 1, pool 2, or pool 3 to have Mobius's text just to see how it goes, that would have been infinitely preferable. And I understand that, you know, maybe that's not a realistic thing you can do, but I think it is better than the alternative of doing this with new cards, right? Like, I get it. You want to release a new card that pushes the envelope, that's exciting, that people want to buy. But if you think that you might need to make a balance change to that card, please just release it in the pre-balanced form. You don't need to put it out there just to see how it goes, because when you put it out there just to see how it goes, you risk undermining consumer confidence. That is my pitch. That is my basic understanding of the situation and my, I guess, worry, right? Because for the last few months, it's been, you know, get Loki, get Elsa, get Mobius. Oh, nerfed, nerfed, nerfed. And so how am I supposed to trust that the meta is going to stay what it is? Not even that the meta is going to stay what it is, that the cards that make it the meta are going to stay what they are and are going to be worthy investments. Now, for the record, Loki, I think pretty clearly will be, but like Elsa or Mobius, I don't really know. And I kind of wonder about the efficacy of this, because it's not necessarily a balance problem. This wouldn't be a problem if card acquisition was more evenly spread in terms of where the cost was, right? If this was not something that is, you know, up here in my little graph that I drew with my hand earlier. If it was more evenly distributed in terms of where you were spending money on card acquisition, I don't think this would be as big of an issue. So just like everything else in Marvel Snap, this one comes back to, it's the economy, stupid. And I'm so frustrated that we're still back here. We're back on the economy. We're back on the economy. But I have no issues in theory with someone trying to create a new metagame, but don't do it with a new card. Like, don't make the new card the meta, or at least don't let it become a pattern. If it happens once or twice, fine. But if this is how balance is going to be done, I think it's a bad idea. When I think of the best cards that they've released in terms of balance, in terms of fun, in terms of creativity. I think of cards like X23, I think of cards like MODOK, cards that are absolutely phenomenal at doing what they do. They get the job done, and they are such important pieces of their decks, right? And then the cards that miss usually fall into two camps. There's the ones that are too bad and the ones that are too good. And the ones that are too bad usually get buffed, but rarely end up being utterly meta dominating. They end up being like, normal pieces of a deck, right? Lady Deathstrike is a good example of a card that's like, oh, okay, no, that card's pretty good right now. But no one's going to complain about Lady Deathstrike, right? Now, the cards that are too good, they tend to fall into two categories. Category number one is this card just has too much numbers on it. That's Elsa, that's Silver Surfer. Numbers too big. Elsa's a 214, Surfer's was like a 318. Just number too big. That's a problem, right? And then the other kind is breaks a fundamental rule of the game. That would be Wave, old Wave, of course. That would be old Zabu. That would be old Loki, or maybe even current Loki. We'll see about that. And those are the cards that I think they get into trouble when they make. And then when you get into trouble and then release a card like Mobius as a band-aid to that, knowing that it's probably a little bit too strong, it's just not a good pattern for me. As far as I understand, though, this is the kind of thing that's like endemic to Snap's collection system. It is a consequence of the collection system, and I really wish that the people who do the card design, the devs, had more freedom to play around with, but because of the collection system, I honestly don't think they do. So let me know what you think in the comments. I am obviously a little bit worked up. I don't know, man. Like, if Mobius, this happening to Mobius isn't just like bad for me because I'm going to play 87 Loki mirrors in a row. It's bad for consumer confidence, and I don't particularly like how it went. And I really do believe that the devs have, at least like the devs that I am aware of, have the best interest of the game at heart. I don't think this is an attempt to like milk people for tokens, but I think they need to understand that there's a degree to which it looks like that, and you need to avoid that at all costs. And that's basically my take. Whether or not you think they're intentionally doing it or not, they need to avoid that, even the perception of that. So thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KM Best. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I will see you in the next one.